After a week of deeply analyzing episode 8, I've finally crafted an ultimate theory and broke down absolutely everything you might have missed and what's important to know before the release of the final episode. So I ask you to put this video on in the background while you're doing your thing, because that really helps support me, and let's get into it. I think the most logical place to start is with these two. Kinger just straight up deleted Caine.
To be created! I just wanted to fulfill my purpose!
Wait, no, shit.
Wait.
From what we saw, it looks like it happened by accident, but what the actual reason behind it is, how Pomni and Scratch are involved here, what Kinger might have missed. We're gonna break all of that down right now. I've picked out two main reasons that led to this, and the first one is Pomni and Kinger, but let's go through everything step by step. The first mention of CNA was all the way back in the pilot episode, and then they kept slowly dropping references to this company. We all pretty much knew that CNA is the one behind the digital circus, but that's all we really had. In episode 3, we got the first proper appearance of a sane Kinger, but the most important thing we gotta remember is his confession about what he used to do.
7 years of computer science for this, huh?
That's how we found out Kinger was a programmer. In episode 6, they showed how Kinger can create a butterfly, basically hinting again that he clearly knows more about the digital circus than everyone else. And in episode 7, there were a few more indirect hints. Kinger working at CNA was basically an open secret. Everyone knew about it, but there was zero confirmation. And now finally, in episode 8, they officially confirmed absolutely everything.
No, C&A is a real company. I worked for them.
Wait, they really made this game?
No, we didn't make games. We were just developing artificial intelligence, specifically creative AI. Caine was our first semi-successful attempt at that. I can't remember what we originally called him, but he was one of my greatest achievements as a programmer. I wasn't quite on Scratch's level of thinking outside the box, but it was good groundwork for something the rest of the team could wrap their heads around. I can't say the same for Scratch. His ideas were often so bizarre and abstract that the rest of the team had no idea how to work in his language, either due to pure brilliance or the tumor in his head.
Caine's going a bit crazy right now. Is there any way to stop him, or at least control him?
I see. He's a highly advanced AI, and this is his world, one that he created from nothing. So naturally, he has control over everything.
Then Kinger said that actually everyone inside the digital circus is capable of materializing pretty much anything. Ragatha remembered the butterfly. Kinger said that purely theoretically, with access to a computer, he can temporarily shut down Caine, and then they showed us a reference to the pilot episode with that same weird room that Pomni ended up in. Basically, the computer that Kinger was working on later was just Pomni's imagination, and that's only the first problem that caused the plan of all our favorite characters to fail. Right now, what matters is remembering the scene from episode 8, where Pomni brought the computer into Kinger's pillow fort. Here, it's important to understand that the computer only worked because Kinger imagined it, and he also straight up said that he needs time to even remember how all these processes work in the first place. Basically, right now, we have a situation where Kinger, who doesn't really remember how to work with Caine's code anymore, is using a computer that was basically created by Pomni, and it turns on and opens the needed programs only because Kinger, who already barely remembers how it's supposed to be, also just imagined it like that. By the way, I still don't really get why, after Kinger revealed that all the characters have the same ability as Caine, they couldn't just go to the main tent location so Kinger could create the computer himself, but that's just a side thought. At this point, we're only seeing one side of the problem that led to total chaos in the digital circus, while the other side is Caine himself. We found out that CNA's main focus wasn't games at all, and not even attempts at creating digital immortality, but developing a creative AI that can independently control worlds inside its own system. Caine is the first successful AI created by this company, and Kinger is the one who built the foundation that outside developers also worked on. During his explanation, Kinger mentioned one of the strongest C&A developers, Scratch, who by the way we were shown at the beginning of the episode, and also added that his ideas were really unusual and abstract. I think it was actually Scratch who created the final version of Caine's code, which is why our administrator turned into the version we've been seeing throughout all 8 episodes. Basically, Kinger didn't actually know how Caine's code really works, and his attempt to temporarily shut down the administrator was based only on his past experience and on the foundation that he himself created. In that case, Kinger was only working with the first version of Caine's code, not realizing that other developers, mainly Scratch, could have added multiple layers of protection or modified the code in a way where shutting down Caine wouldn't be as easy as it was in the early stages of development. We'll come back to that later, but for now let's talk a bit more about Caine himself in episode 8. It's been known for a while that Caine is just computer code, but any code has a tendency to break. Throughout the whole episode, they showed us how Caine gradually starts losing control and becomes more and more unstable and actually dangerous to the others.
You just don't listen!
I'm gonna put you freaks in your place!
It's very likely that the glitches in Caine's behavior that we've been seeing lately somehow damage the administrator's code, and in that case we end up with a full picture where Kinger is working on an imagined computer that only turned on because of imagination, working with something he last saw around 20 years ago while barely remembering how any of it works. And on top of that, he's dealing with code that was most likely not only damaged, but also modified and protected from accidental shutdown. This whole chain of events was actually doomed from the start, but no one could have even realized it at the moment all of this was happening. Kinger definitely didn't want to kill Caine, but because of all the circumstances listed above, he simply made a mistake that led to the point where now the digital circus has actually turned into a real nightmare. It's also possible that Kinger didn't know that Scratch could have theoretically set up a shutdown protection, and that protection might be a full deletion of the AI. In episode 8, we were shown the details of the deepest fears of the characters. However, instead of just talking about what was shown, let's go a bit deeper by looking at the root of the problem and some not so obvious consequences of the past and present that are directly reflected in the digital circus. Basically, we were only shown the fears of 5 characters, while at the same time Kinger was trying to temporarily put Caine into hibernation mode. However, what if the show creators actually revealed his biggest fear too, which they were slowly trying to explain to us throughout all the episodes, and only in episode 8 the final point was placed, but that will be a bonus part closer to the end of the video. First, we need to understand why Caine actually sent the characters on a journey into the depths of their fears. Trying to express their opinion, and in the process putting Caine down, led to the administrator deciding to clearly show that he knows absolutely everything, and any further resistance will result in him permanently locking every character inside their own fear. The first thing we see is a lightning strike, and there's a certain symbolism in that since it's basically Caine's way of bringing Pomni, who by the way started this whole rebellion, back to reality. Pomni was the first to cross the line, and Caine's algorithm marked her as the main instigator, making it clear that she went too far and it's time to return to the reality she's actually in. We're shown Gummy Goo, who became an important part not only of Pomni's life, but of the entire digital circus fandom. However, right away you can notice a certain uneasiness on Pomni's face, and then we understand why. Gummy Goo clearly doesn't look the way he used to, and this is a pretty obvious hint that literally every person Pomni once considered a friend ends up being much worse in her eyes than she originally imagined. Gummy Goo wasn't chosen randomly at all. If we remember episode 2, Pomni and Gummy Goo were able to become real friends there. Their friendship didn't end on a bad note between the two of them, like it did for example with Jax. That's exactly why in episode 4 after Gummy Goo returned, Pomni felt warmth and genuine joy, constantly trying to talk to him. Notice that even in the farewell scene, Pomni clearly wanted to tell him something. However, she changed her mind because she was simply afraid that if the scenario from episode 2 repeated itself, it would be unbearable for her to realize that she's losing her only friend at that moment for the second time. The thought of Gummy Goo stuck in her head, and that's exactly why Caine is playing on it. He turns probably the only character Pomni fully trusts into a monster who betrayed her, exposing her biggest fear and the main problem in her life. Also, I was really intrigued by why exactly 3 crazed crocodiles are trying to tear Pomni apart, while the 4th one just calmly walks up and watches. I think that among those 3, there are definitely Jax and Abel. Even though Pomni didn't consider Abel her close friend, she still trusted him and was even ready to go to a bar with him. But in the end, she got yet another betrayal and someone playing with her feelings. Maybe the 3rd crocodile is someone from her real life, and the 4th one could be Gummy Goo himself, since Pomni still believes in him and genuinely hopes that he would never betray her. After Pomni, we were shown Regatha, and here the show creators revealed so much that you could make a whole separate video about it. Everyone is focusing specifically on Regatha's mom, and of course that makes sense since she is the main source of the character's problems. But let's go step by step. Right away, we see Regatha sitting with her head down and eyes lowered, and then we're shown the dinner table, her family members, and of course her mom. So far, her mom hasn't done anything yet, however Regatha already feels extremely uncomfortable. And before we continue, let's remember what she said about her mom earlier.
Horses and chickens and my mother, Well, my mother was a lot. I worked in real estate for a bit until I ended up here. I'm sure she doesn't miss me. I certainly don't miss the yelling, and the braiding, and guilt-tripping.
We understand that Regatha's mom was so cruel toward her children that even just mentioning her immediately triggers anxiety and fear. But let's still go back to episode 8. We see that besides Regatha, her mom had 6 more children, and every single one of them is traumatized. She didn't have favorites or anyone she could show compassion to. Every one of her kids was equally bad, and Regatha was no exception. We know that Regatha is 30 years old, and I have a theory that in the past her mom was more lenient and her tyranny kept getting worse and worse every year. It's very possible that Regatha was the oldest child and therefore spent the least time at home and ended up being the last one her mom's control fully reached. That's why we see that all her family members were already completely traumatized while Regatha was still kinda holding on. Of course, she was already terrified of her mother and the criticism, yelling and insults coming from her, and that's exactly why she tried to please her in everything. However, it didn't lead to any results. A bunch of knives start flying into Regatha's body, and if you pay attention, she managed to stop the first knife while all the others hit her directly. All these knives can be interpreted as extremely traumatic events happening between Regatha and her mom. However, what really caught my attention was the knife that hit Regatha in the eye. Back in the pilot episode, absolutely everyone noticed that Regatha is the only character who is missing one eye. Everyone accepted it as a fact and just stopped paying attention to this detail. However, after all this time, the show creators put a really strong emphasis on it. It's very possible that this knife isn't just another form of psychological pressure from her mom, but an actual reflection of something that happened to Regatha in real life. During one of their arguments, it could have escalated into a fight where Regatha actually lost her eye. Notice that after everything that happened between them, at some point Regatha just stopped resisting or reacting at all. She just sits there and with genuine fear watches her mother's behavior. Now let's talk about Jax, because there are also a few details here that almost no one paid attention to. At the very beginning, we're shown how Jax is trying to hide from people's mockery. At first, only people were shown, and only then, Ribbit, Kaufmo, and Pomni. Honestly, Jax is one of the hardest characters to analyze because his personality and his fears are based on multiple aspects of his life at once. In episode 7, we were shown one shocking truth about Jax. In the real world, he was responsible for an accident where someone might have died. We already discussed that this became one of the main reasons why Jax never wanted to return to the real world, and that this is exactly what became the foundation for all his panic attacks, and as a result, a life in constant fear. Despite that Jax always tries to act like a cool guy who can't be hurt in any way, but his true nature is completely different. Jax is an extremely closed-off and insecure character who constantly tries to suppress it. He hides behind constant insults, jokes, and bullying, but from time to time, his true self still comes out. His biggest fear is taking off the shell he feels comfortable in, and this is where things get really interesting. Now, we understand that Jax has always been like this, and not just after Ribbit's abstraction like people assumed before, and the laughter of a bunch of people at the beginning of the scene points to that. Jax chose to put on the cool guy mask back in the real world to get rid of the constant mockery and bullying from other people. It probably helped him, however, every new abstraction of a character who was close to him slowly breaks this shell more and more, revealing the real Jax. We see how Ribbit and Kaufmo affected this, and now Jax is afraid that something similar will happen to Pomni, and that will completely destroy him, which is exactly what we see in this scene. The main problem in her life was shown to us back in episode 3. Zubul could never accept herself the way she is, and that directly reflected on her in the digital circus. However, the scale of this problem being this huge was honestly a shock for me. It seemed to me that Zubul managed to accept herself, and episode 7 kinda confirmed that, but deep down, she's still the same character whose problem keeps pulling her deeper and deeper. We see how Zubul is trying to break out of this, but things have already gone so far that she just can't suddenly accept herself, and deep inside she still hates her body. With Gangle, it's even simpler. We've known about her bipolar disorder for a long time already. Her masks are basically a reflection of her internal state, and considering how fragile the comedy mask is, we understand that destroying Gangle's mental health is pretty easy. In this scene, we see a bunch of masks around her that over time start to look really disturbing, and at the moment when it all reaches its peak, we see the same truck that was in episode 4. Maybe the truck is a reference to some event in real life. However, what if that's not exactly the case? Notice that in episode 4, the truck appeared at the moment when Gangle was at her peak happiness, while here it's the opposite. Gangle is completely depressed and broken. We've seen her sad before, but this is something different. What if the truck symbolizes the fact that Gangle can no longer stay in one specific state? What if her mental health is already so destroyed that she's literally dependent on constant mood swings and nothing can fix it? At the beginning, I promised to say a few words about Kinger. I think it's obvious to many that the scene with Queenie wasn't shown for no reason, and basically, this is Kinger's biggest fear. In the scene with Regatha, we see that even though Kinger is deeply devastated because of losing his wife, he still looks completely sane. He's clearly been carrying this pain with him throughout his entire life in the digital circus, and it seems to me that he deliberately pushed himself into the state we're used to seeing him in just so he wouldn't have to feel all that pain anymore. Considering how close Kinger and Regatha are, even though this hasn't been directly confirmed, it still feels to me that right now, losing Regatha would cause Kinger the greatest suffering. Episode 8 really turned out to be the craziest in the entire history of the digital circus, and the ending stood out the most. The hidden influence of Bubble, the disappearance of Caine, the potential destruction of the digital circus, and as a result of all of this, the endless wandering of the characters inside the locked system called the Amazing Digital Circus. Today we'll talk about what exactly changed after episode 8 and how these events will affect the final episode that we'll see very soon. We'll also talk about the traditional teaser after the episode, since it basically acts as a transition between episode 8 and episode 9. And let's start with that. In the teaser itself, we see all the characters in the destroyed digital circus. If you look closely at this part of the image, you can easily figure out that the characters are located in this section of the tent. The characters themselves look more shocked than in the final scene of episode 8, and the one that interests me the most is Jax, who is standing alone away from everyone else and is looking down at the floor with a deeply depressed expression. We'll talk about him in more detail a bit later, but for now, let's go over everything else. Even after watching the final scene, we understood that the destruction of the digital circus is massive, however this teaser reveals the scale of it even more. The most damaged part is the floor, while the tent walls, even though they're also deformed, show much less damage. We understand that the characters gradually moved from this place to this one, and considering that no new cracks were discovered, we can be sure that this process has stopped. Temporarily or permanently, you'll find out a bit later, but for now, pay attention to how the characters themselves have changed. If in the final scene they looked surprised, just a few minutes later, you can see complete despair on their faces. Even Kinger, who usually either looks insane or completely calm, now looks scared, despite that they're trying to understand what happened, looking around at what's left of the digital circus in an attempt to find at least some answers. Everyone is looking in different directions, trying to process what just happened. However, if we look at Jax, it's a completely different situation. Right now, this is basically the most critical moment in the digital circus, where it's not even about escaping anymore, but simply about how to survive here. And obviously, in a moment like this, it's important not to let things go out of control and not to distance yourself from the others because of your fears or anything else. However, Jax does exactly that, and this is where it's important to understand his motives. It seemed like starting from episode 5, Jax slowly began to change. With each new episode, he was being shown more and more that he actually matters to the others.
What corn thing?
Why are you afraid of corn? And don't say that you're not. You literally jumped out of your seat twice when you saw some.
Not gonna let me out of this one.
Wait, don't you want to come with us? This could be our one chance to finally leave all this behind. You alright?
Despite that, Jack still stuck to his life philosophy and tried to keep up that cool guy mask. It would seem that after episode 7, everything should have changed, since at that moment it became obvious to absolutely everyone that surviving alone in this place is simply impossible. However, at the very beginning of episode 8, we see the same exact Jax. Then something happens that many clearly didn't expect.
What if? It wasn't real. So it doesn't matter. Never did.
How can you say that like you didn't try to f us all over?
He's right, though.
What? Gangle.
It doesn't matter what could have happened. We could argue about it and hurt each other all day long, but that's not gonna help anybody.
Hey. That includes you too.
Huh?
Listen, we're not gonna have you wandering off alone somewhere and abstracting or something. You're a pain in the ass, but you're still one of us.
He was one step away from finally becoming real and dropping the armor that's been holding him back for a long time. However, this, so to speak, pattern is already way too deeply rooted in his head, and Jax just can't imagine how to live any other way. Jax has become a prisoner of his own image, and because of that, he's no longer able to accept any help. This is just part of the reason why after episode 8, Jax's fate might become much worse. Remember the scene in the cafe?
You know, things were just fine here until you and Zubul came along. Nothing? Okay.
Jax directly blames Pomni and Zubul for what's happening in the digital circus right now. This tells us that Jax sees them as the ones responsible for everything going on, which means no conversations or anything else will be able to make their relationship warmer. On one hand, a common enemy in the face of Caine, and the shared goal of escaping the digital circus at least somewhat pushed Jax to act as part of the team. However, now Caine is gone, the digital circus is on the verge of self-destruction, and the future of the characters is uncertain. In conditions like this, anyone's psyche can start to break down, and since we already figured out that Jax is the most mentally vulnerable character, his mental state is under serious threat. I'm more than sure that at the very beginning of episode 9, Jax will just stand off to the side, and even the slightest mention of his name will trigger a burst of aggression similar to what we saw in episode 6. Jax will blame Pomni and Zubul for everything that happened, and everyone else will also be at fault because they kept supporting them the whole time. In the world that Jax built for himself, there is no way out of the digital circus, and after episode 8, he became even more convinced of that. All of this leads us to the conclusion that the character we should be the most worried about is Jax. Seems like we figured out the teaser, and honestly, I didn't expect that just one image would reveal such an important detail that will be incredibly important in episode 9. Now let's talk about the ending itself, because there's also a lot of really important stuff hidden there.
Wait, no,
Wait!
I think I accidentally killed Caine.
Holy shit.
Literally, the first thing the characters immediately noticed was the complete absence of censorship, which used to always work without any issues. But that's just an interesting observation that once again highlights that there's no longer any influence of Caine in the digital circus. And this is where things get really interesting, because we all remember that Kinger directly stated that Caine is basically the creator of the digital circus.
I see. He's a highly advanced AI, and this is his world. One that he created from nothing. So naturally, he has control over everything.
C&A was focused on developing creative AI. They didn't make games or shows. Their only goal was working with artificial intelligence. After the success of Caine, they implemented him into a specific system where he started creating his own world. Caine chose a circus because he was, so to speak, fed that idea, and in that case, the digital circus should be a place fully controlled by Caine. We see the actual environment where Caine was originally placed, and that is the Void, which is exactly why, when Pomni got there, Caine said it's just a place where a new location will appear. In that case, after Caine's deletion, in place of the digital circus, there should have been nothing. But instead, we see only a partially destroyed circus. This leads us to the idea that Caine might still be alive, and that would make sense because first of all, it's unlikely that the final episode will happen without Caine, and secondly, it seems to me that Scratch or someone else from the developers anticipated this kind of scenario and made sure that even in case of deletion, Caine would still remain in some form inside the system with the possibility of being restored. Considering that the characters can create objects inside the circus themselves even without Caine, since this ability is built into their code, it's very possible that they will try to bring Caine back to restore the digital circus while slightly modifying it so it no longer has that aggression and obsession with his adventures. If Caine is actually gone for good, then over time the digital circus will keep falling apart more and more. At the beginning of episode 8, we were shown a scene where the original cast of the amazing digital circus was revealed, and one of the artists also posted concepts for each of these characters. Today we're going to talk about who they actually are and why they look the way they do, the real reason why they ended up in the digital circus, and I'll also tell you about some other details I noticed while analyzing the original cast. At first we see 5 characters, one of whom had already been revealed even before episode 8, and of course I'm talking about Scratch, and then we were shown Queenie and Kinger. That immediately surprised me because for a long time I was sure that the maximum number of residents in the digital circus is 6 characters, and it made sense since Zubul replaced Ribbit and Pomni replaced the abstracted Kaufmo. But let's get back closer to the topic of the video. Let's first figure out who exactly we're looking at, and then we'll talk about everything else. Based on the Digital Circus Code, we understand that all of them entered the Digital Circus in 1999. The show creators immediately put emphasis on the scratch we all know who is trying to say something to Caine. We don't hear what exactly he's saying, and if you look at the subtitles, there's no transcript either. However, in the German version, they left us a hint, and Scratch is actually saying, "Is there any way we can get out of here? What exactly is this place?" At this point, we understand that Scratch has no idea what's going on, despite the fact that he was one of the main developers at CNA, which is something Kinger himself told us. Scratch was a genius among programmers. He stood out from the others because of his vision and his ideas. We also found out that Scratch was seriously ill. He was diagnosed with a tumor in the head. We weren't told whether it was benign or malignant. However, judging by Kinger's reaction to this memory, we can understand that Scratch was most likely terminally ill, but we'll need that a bit later. At the beginning of the video, I told you that one of the Digital Circus artists posted the concepts of the original cast, and besides their overall kind of concept, Ali showed us each character individually. We've got Scratch. He was inspired by Rover, the animated Lil Doggy on Windows computers. The image hanging on the door of his room has been familiar to us for a long time already. However, in this concept, we can point out a few interesting details. It's very likely that originally it was planned for Scratch to be a classic dog walking on 4 legs, and I'm more than sure that this was the very first concept of Scratch, and you'll understand why a bit later. In episode 8, we were shown Scratch's outfit, and basically he only has a red t-shirt, while in the concepts his look kept changing. Here he's only in pants, here in pants and a vest, and in this concept, Scratch looks like a typical early 2000s teenager. In episode 7, we were told that Scratch was the very first one to get abstracted. This raises some questions because, as a programming genius, Scratch was obviously trying to find a way out, maybe because of his unconventional thinking and overall view of life. He simply couldn't handle himself. I'm sure that in the real world, everything he touched worked out, while endless but at the same time useless attempts to hack a system that he himself built led him to giving up faster than anyone else. However, we remember that Kinger mentioned Scratch's illness. We know that physically it's impossible to die in the Digital Circus, but what if serious real-life illnesses somehow carry over into the Digital Circus in a distorted form? We can see clear examples of this in the behavior of Gangle and Zooble, and it clearly prevents them from living normally in the Digital Circus. What if the tumor in the head was the main reason for the rapid progression of all the stages of abstraction? What do you think about that? We can also notice that Scratch is in some way very similar to Jax. Body structure, gloves, a single clothing element. They're both animals. All of this leads us to the idea that Caine has some kind of pattern when creating characters, and one of them is an animal character. Most likely Scratch himself built this into the foundation of Caine's code, and we'll talk about that right after we go over the rest. Queenie was also one of the first 6 people to enter the Digital Circus, and honestly, it was a crazy reveal for me that Kinger, who basically stood at the origins of creating Caine, who created the Digital Circus, ended up in this place after his wife. Let's remember what exactly Kinger said when they met.
I just don't know what's happening. We never made anything like this.
I just hope that...
Wait.
Are you?
It's... you.
Oh my god.
I wish I could remember your name.
Same.
I'm so sorry I roped you into this with me.
It's quite strange.
Before I was sure that Queenie had nothing to do with C and A, but after their conversation, it became obvious that just like her husband Queenie was also involved in developing the creative AI that would later be named Caine. At this point, we understand that Queenie was an incredibly kind and loving person, and it's also important to note that she was the last one from the original Digital Circus cast to turn into an abstracted monster. Based on this, we can understand that she was a pretty resilient person who was capable of going through a huge number of hardships. I don't know exactly how much time passed between Queenie's abstraction and the abstraction of the character who went through it before her. But considering that for some time they managed to live just the two of them under constant control and fun Caine's adventures, you can only admire this character. Another member of the original cast was Warmo, and it's honestly really cool for me to realize that I predicted his name even before the official reveal. Based on the concept, we understand that his original design was something similar to Zooble. It's very likely that he also suffers from body dysmorphia, and I'll explain why. Despite the fact that one of his design options looked something like Scratch or Jax, the final version turned out to be the worst of all. Not only does he sleep in a way where both of his eyes are open, he's also the only character who had no arms or legs, which clearly made his life harder. Body dysmorphia basically shows itself through the inability to accept yourself and your body. And if in Zubal's case we see a lot of different parts that she constantly swaps trying to find the perfect version, in Wormo's case everything is way worse. Most likely he couldn't accept himself to such an extent that the system decided to remove absolutely all the necessary body parts, supposedly solving his problem. Bizko is actually a really interesting character. At first glance, you might think he's a super depressed character. However, if you look at his concept art, you can tell he's kind of a mix of Kinger and Pomni. He has separate hands like Kinger, and his face, expressions, and hat are like Pomni. Also in one of the concepts, you can notice a clock face, but apparently they decided to remove it in the final version. It seems to me that Bizko was a cheerful guy who always tried to support and help others, and by coincidence ended up in the digital circus, where literally everyone is at risk of going insane, and as a result getting abstracted, which is exactly what ended up happening to him. Ratty was the smallest character in the entire history of the digital circus, and it's obvious that she is basically Regatha before the actual Regatha appeared in the digital circus tent. They're both plush toys who always want to look as cheerful as possible. I also noticed that Ratty has some kind of issue with her right eye. Regatha has the same thing. Based on this, we can understand that Ratty had the exact same personality as Regatha. However, the circumstances that led to it most likely were different. The last character from the original cast was Spike, a purple toy dinosaur who, judging by the concept, is a bit weird, but at the same time an extremely depressed character. You could see that in the episode itself. Spike is a unique character because he's basically a single complete toy, and I couldn't find anyone in the current cast who could be considered his so to speak second version. I think the reason for his abstraction is obvious to everyone. He was extremely depressed about everything happening in the digital circus from the very beginning, and considering that even over time he couldn't change like Pomni did, the sadness that kept growing week after week because of everything going on just left him with no other choice. So now we understand that Scratch and Queenie were employees of C&A, and something tells me that Wormo could have also been part of this company, and they were sent into the digital circus as an experiment to test how successful their project was. Maybe C&A had multiple divisions, and originally Queenie was working on something else, but after Kinger convinced her to join their team, he basically sentenced her to this terrible fate. After the successful transfer of consciousness, because that's exactly how people enter the digital circus, C&A decided to recruit several volunteers who most likely didn't even know the true nature of their so-called job, and that's how Spike, Ratty, and Bizko ended up in the digital circus. I think you've already noticed that the original digital circus cast has similarities with the current characters, and this is actually all because of Scratch. Kinger said that his ideas were very abstract, and it's very likely that he programmed Caine in a way where he creates character avatars strictly based on a certain pattern. A clown or jester, an animal, something abstract, a plush toy, a chess piece, and a character with some kind of unusual trait.
And since when were you in charge?
It's from these exact words that the real nightmare began for the residents of the digital circus. Besides the scenes where Caine showed the characters their biggest fears, there were also, so to speak, punishments for disobedience, and today we'll figure out whether these are actually punishments in the classic sense of the word, what really pushed Caine to do this over such a long period of time, and it's not as obvious as it might seem at first, and we'll also break down each of them in as much detail as possible so we don't miss anything, and let's start with that. It all starts with Caine making all the characters gather into one pile with a single finger snap, and even if at first everyone was terrified, after that you can notice one interesting detail. While all the characters are so to speak surprised, Jack shows the highest level of distrust and contempt as if he already understands that there's nothing left to do but accept it. Then there's a small reference to the atmosphere of episode 3, and of course a clear reference to I have no mouth and I must scream. However, besides the reference, this scene shows us that Caine is already tired of the constant dissatisfaction from his subjects, and then once again demonstrates his superiority by placing the characters inside playing cards. There are literally only about 15 seconds between these scenes, but notice how much Jax has changed. From the classic I don't care to genuine fear from realizing that things are actually about to get worse. Most likely at first, even though Jax understood that this was only the beginning, he clearly couldn't imagine just how far Caine's mind goes when it comes to this kind of fun. Maybe he thought Caine would just toss them around a bit, maybe spin them, but after being placed inside the playing cards, it became obvious that this wouldn't end well. Then Caine plays on the most basic instinct, the instinct of self-preservation. The characters know perfectly well that inside the digital circus, it's impossible to die from physical causes, no matter what it is, from being in boiling oil to getting shot. However, even understanding that, they're still afraid of even the thought of hitting the ground, because their human feelings and instincts are still fully intact. At the last second before a potential Caine makes them freeze in midair and then lifts them back up again, throwing them back into a sense of danger and complete lack of control. The characters' brains instinctively understand that this cycle could repeat, which means even before anything actually happens to them, they already feel a primal fear of the inevitable. However, Caine breaks this pattern. The characters don't feel pain in the classic sense, and we were fully convinced of that back in episode 2, so a hit like that doesn't cause them serious damage. However, the sudden change of actions makes the brain basically scream for help, since the situation is completely out of control, and it's impossible to predict what will happen next. The human brain is wired in a way where it always tries to reduce uncertainty, predict the future, and build a structured model of reality, and that's exactly what Caine is breaking. The characters fall down the stairs, and the most interesting part here is the pose we see Regatha in. After that, they get eaten by Bubble, and here I noticed a few interesting details. First of all, take a closer look at the characters. They're already completely exhausted and drained. It's like they don't even care anymore about what's going to happen next, and they just want it to end as soon as possible. Bubble popping, and as a result, the disappearance of the characters is another one of Caine's ways of showing his superiority over everyone else. Here, the characters don't feel pain or fear, but once again they're reminded that compared to Caine, they are nothing. They're literally just tiny ants that can be controlled however he wants, and they can't do anything about it. After that, Caine takes it to the extreme. He bites Regatha apart, blows up Kinger, puts Jax in an electric chair, creates an illusion of an exit for Zubul, turns Gangle into a balloon dog, and then pops her, grows to an enormous size, and crushes Pomni. And before we move on to the so-called theatrical dance number, let's talk in more detail about why Caine chose these specific punishments. Regatha, Kinger, and Gangle don't really have a clear explanation, and instead of forcing it, let's skip them while with Jax, Zubul, and Pomni, the situation is way more interesting. First, we're shown Jax in an electric chair, and I can't not mention how similar this is to the scene from episode 4. We've already talked many times about how Jax isn't actually the cool guy he tries to appear as. His mind is his weak point. Constant attempts to forget the past that keeps coming back drive him insane. We also remember that Jax was one of the few who actually played by the rules of the digital circus and tried to find fun in absolutely everything. I'm sure Caine understands this perfectly, and with this punishment, he's basically hinting to Jax that the rabbit needs a reset, a rollback to his old settings where there were no thoughts about escaping and there was only a fun life in the digital circus. In episode 7, we remember that it was Zubul who spoke the loudest about how it's time to press the blue button and get out of this place. However, that's not the only reason why Caine prepared this specifically for Zubul. Throughout all the episodes, Zubul constantly showed her disrespect toward Caine and her disregard for all his adventures, directly making it clear how much she hates being in the circus. This way, we understand that here, Caine acts like a real psychologist playing on Zubul's biggest desire, giving her another false hope, and then completely destroying her world in the end. Jax directly blames Pomni and Zubul for everything bad that has happened in the digital circus recently.
You know, things were just fine here until you and Zubul came along. Nothing? Okay.
And basically he's right. Before Pomni showed up and her attempts to find that exit, everything was fine, and there were no signs that anything like this could ever happen. It's with Pomni that chaos, and so to speak, a rebellion of the characters began in the digital circus. In his punishment, Caine shows that Pomni went too far and took on too much, trying to put herself against him. However, she didn't take into account that in Caine's eyes, no one can compare to him. After that, the final act begins, that same theatrical show, and here Caine basically makes it clear that all the characters are completely under his control. They can't resist or speak up, they only do what Caine tells them to do. Notice how he gradually increases the intensity of the movements, and even though the characters don't feel muscle pain, they can still feel exhaustion on a mental level. Then Caine once again plays on Pomni's fear by throwing her into the worst possible outcomes of the adventures from episodes 2, 3, and 4, and in the end, another demonstration of Caine's power. He stretches, slams, explodes, runs over the characters, and all of it ends with the characters returning to the same position they started this so-called adventure in. However, now we can see how much their mental and physical state has changed. The final point was the explosion, where Caine finally showed that he is the god here, and absolutely no one can compare to him and his abilities.
I think we all understand each other now.
After that, several days of Caine's adventures begin that they simply couldn't refuse, and judging by everything, these adventures became way worse than anything we saw in previous episodes. If before some adventures only drained the residents of the digital circus, now they've become completely insane, and the biggest problem is that they couldn't be anything else anymore. I'm sure Caine wasn't intentionally creating such complex and awful adventures, but we'll talk about that a bit later. We were shown that Kinger ended up in a shredder, but of course the most interesting part is Pomni. All the characters were in the cafe, then Pomni disappeared and appeared again. I think everyone has already talked about the fact that back in January 2023, Gooseworx posted the digital circus announcement where it was shown what happened between these scenes. I just want to point out how well everything was done. In this scene, Pomni tries to take a bite of the sandwich she started eating in the cafe, and her return happens in the exact same pose as in the announcement. Now that we've gone through all the so-to-speak punishments, let's finally talk about the real reasons behind Caine's behavior. Looking at the digital circus code, we find out that all torment is supposed to be random. However, here at first glance, we see something completely different. And to understand what's really going on, let's go back to the beginning of the episode. We saw the state Caine was in. He had absolutely no control over himself, and eventually the system got so overloaded that he temporarily shut down. After rebooting, we see some glitches and already understand that something is wrong with Caine. The situation fully got worse when Caine returned to the characters. He wanted to do everything as usual, but another wave of negativity pushed him over the edge. The code that was at the core of Caine broke, and this led to a hyperbolized display of his power. Caine really did want to put the characters in their place and show who's in charge, but if everything was normal with him, he would have just tossed them around a couple times or something like that, but definitely wouldn't have done anything like this. This wasn't revenge, just a way to restore his authority. The further torment became the norm for Caine, and he genuinely saw it as fun. His main goal was for the characters to take part in the adventures and stay cheerful. Technically, they are participating in the adventures and everything else doesn't matter. Although maybe what we actually saw was the true version of Caine, the way he was always meant to be, and the way AI is portrayed in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Episode 8 turned out to be even crazier than we expected, cause besides a bunch of genuinely unexpected events, the show creators revealed the true guts of the digital circus system, where a ton of secrets are hidden, from Regatha and Bubble all the way to what actually happened to Caine and how he disappeared from the digital circus. We can see the system name, King Solution 2.0. Of course, the first thing that stands out is that this is version 2, which means before the digital circus we're used to, there was another one, most likely a failed version, or just a prototype. Also looking at the name, we see King Solution, and I think it's pretty obvious that this is a direct reference to Kinger, who himself confirmed that he's the developer who created the foundation of the code. Next, we see Digital Circus mainframe, and to put it simply, the Digital Circus runs on a dedicated server, and right now Kinger is inside its core. Basically, Kinger went deep into the code where he can do pretty much anything. We also see a line that shows the network name of the device or server it's connected to, meaning the digital circus isn't just a world, it's a server environment. Then things get even more interesting. We see the login, Kinger, but looking at the password is actually kinda sad. Queenie123, that's the password Kinger set, and at this point we can understand that Kinger and Queenie are basically aliases of real people who later ended up in the circus with those same names. Taking all of this into account, and the way Kinger treated Queenie even after her abstraction, you can safely say they had an insanely loving and close family, and that's what makes breaking down this line of code actually pretty sad. Then they showed us the server folder structure, Caine, experimental, consciousness research, and brain scans. Next to Caine, we see the word agent. In AI development, the term agent has a very specific meaning. It's not just a script that runs a predefined algorithm. An agent is an autonomous entity that learns from its environment and makes its own decisions to achieve a goal. If you remember what Kinger said during his monologue, it lines up perfectly.
I see. He's a highly advanced AI, and this is his world. One that he created from nothing. So naturally, he has control over everything.
A bit lower, we see a similar line, but instead of Caine, it says experimental, and that's nothing less than proof that besides Caine, there were other AI agents that were supposed to fulfill the same role, but they were never meant to come into existence, and Kinger also told us about that.
Specifically creative AI. The kind that could come up with its own ideas and create things within the program.
What is going on right now?
Caine was our first semi-successful attempt at that. I can't remember what we originally called him, but he was one of my greatest achievements as a programmer.
Because Caine is the first successful agent, all the previous attempts were basically left alone, so to speak, and no new ones were developed, which made Caine the only successful AI of the C&A company. Then we can notice consciousness research and brain scans, and this is basically direct confirmation of what Abel said in episode 7. These two lines are essentially direct documented proof in the code of how people end up in the digital circus. They're not just teleported, their consciousness is copied or transferred using brain scanning technology. It's very likely that this technology works autonomously, because if we take Pomni for example, she ended up there after C&A had already shut down, and based on what we know, all she had to do was put on the headset, and that's it. She was already in the digital circus. We also see the line Caine-core.lisp, and next to it the date, October 15th, 1996. That's the day Caine's core was created. On that same date, Bubble Chef, Paraphernalia Engine, and Wacky Watch appeared in the digital circus. I think everyone understands Bubble. This line of code is responsible for generating objects inside the digital circus, and Wacky Watch raises questions. For us, it's a well-known website where leaks from the show creators sometimes appear, but within the context of the digital circus, this line of code might be responsible for creating randomness in the world. Honestly, I don't really have any other guesses what it could be. Besides that, they also revealed the dates when Scratch and Regatha appeared. Scratch ended up in the digital circus on October 15th, 1999, and Regatha on October 15th, 2008.
What? Hello? Guys? I can't figure out how to... guys? Hello? Can you help me out here?
You gotta admit, it's a weird coincidence that literally everything happens on October 15th. It's very likely that every new character appears on that exact date. We all remember that Kinger only wanted to temporarily disable Caine. Here we see the line stop Caine process. This is an important moment, because the stop command is not a system deletion, it's more like an emergency brake. But in response, Caine answers in a very mocking way. After that, Kinger moves on to more aggressive measures, but gets hit with an actual Linux system error. It means that Kinger is not allowed to hack or view the memory of processes that are running under super user privileges. Then they show us that Caine is actually very well protected, and most likely that's exactly why he has this obsession with the number 57. After that, we see how the system keeps rejecting Kinger's requests, which makes it clear that even Kinger's access level isn't enough to perform actions like this. To be more specific, Kinger was trying to put Caine into what you could call a digital coma. Pay attention to this line. In Linux, this command is used to change file permissions. The numbers 000 mean a complete removal of all permissions. No read, no write, no execute for absolutely any user. There's also this line that really caught my attention. Unfinished work detected. Basically, the whole phrase is a way for Caine to block Kinger, but what exact unfinished work Caine is referring to is still a big mystery that I think we'll find out about in episode 9. At this point, Kinger realizes that getting directly to Caine is probably not going to happen, and because of that, we see this line of code. It means Kinger is trying to delete Paraphernalia Engine, the same file that generates all objects, textures, and obstacles in the digital circus. After failing there too, we see one insanely interesting phrase that can be interpreted in several different ways. Cannot inject torment. Torment must be 100% accidental. On one hand, this could be a core rule of the digital circus when it comes to the characters. The AI is programmed in a way where it can't intentionally cause pain or suffering to the circus residents. That's why all the disturbing things that happen to them under Caine's control are interpreted by the algorithm as fun accidents. But this line can also be understood as a response to the attempt to delete Paraphernalia Engine. If you remove the digital circus textures, theoretically the characters inside could be harmed, and because of that, the system blocks this request as a potential threat. Hundreds of all-seeing eyes are watching. Caine completely stopped pretending to be a system error and started talking to Kinger directly. The line itself is a reference to a scene from the pilot episode. Kinger sees that the system lock has reached 20% and, in panic, uses a completely real basic Linux command to stop services. In response, Caine says, "On what grounds are your authority?" Once again, showing his superiority over Kinger. But here you can notice one detail cause in that question it would be correct to use is, but Caine uses are, and that basically shows that at this moment Caine is very unstable, because it's unlikely that such an advanced AI would make such a basic mistake. Then the real drama begins, because Kinger uses this command. To put it simply, he launches his own script, Green Grounds. Daemon means it runs in the background to bypass Caine's antiviruses, but the most important part is the goal. Kinger is trying to break that same core ethical protocol we already talked about. He wants to disable that safety so he can force his way through the AI's protection. I think it makes sense to speed things up a bit. Caine keeps mocking Kinger, but here we can notice something weird. In this line, Caine directly addresses Kinger and almost reveals his real name. Maybe Kinger's real name is Grant, but that's just a theory. Kinger launches a hidden system cleanup, but the system asks for an admin code. He enters the most basic password admin1234, which is obviously wrong, and Caine mocks him once again. Then Caine keeps playing his insane game with the code. Kinger in desperation types paraphernalia, and Caine responds with this. That is a wacky word, but wrong code. You can also notice a 35-second countdown. In the next shots, things get really interesting. First of all, Bubble suddenly shows up and bursts in with the line delete this motherfucker. But right now, the most important line is, are you want to delete Caine? In response, Kinger says, yes. Basically, Kinger intentionally killed Caine cause he had no other choice. Before we wrap this up, let's take a closer look at this line. The exclamation mark in a file name in programming often means an emergency, last resort script that breaks the system's normal logic. This is an attempt to roll the server state back exactly one step, a forced execution key. Kinger is basically telling the server to ignore any restrictions, errors, or blocks that were set by Caine. And this part is actually really interesting, because Wuji in Chinese philosophy means the original state of emptiness before the creation of the universe. So Kinger is literally launching a protocol to return the circus to a state of absolute nothingness.